This is Dennis Raimondi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Dr. David R. Loy. He is an academician. He has a tremendous academic background, retired from teaching now, and is also a Zen teacher. He's widely published in addition to his work in Zen or his teaching, being a Zen teacher. He has a deep commitment to environmental issues. Thank you so very much, David, for taking the time to come on with us today.
Well, thank you, Dennis and Phil, for this invitation, this opportunity.
David, we have a lot to talk about. You've been in the world of spirituality as a practitioner, as a teacher, and a scholar for many years. You've written books. You've got about 10,000 magazine articles and journal articles. And but let's begin going back a bit in the past and let us know what brought you to your spiritual path and why the emphasis on, or how did the emphasis on Buddhism and Zen in particular come about?
Sure. Well, I'm another child of the 60s. In my case, late 60s. I graduated from college in 69. And at that time, of course, the Vietnam War was still raging. And I became a draft resister, moved out to the Bay Area, and worked in the draft resistance movement, and expected to go to prison for that. But in the end, the system was changed. They came in with a lottery. Selective Service came in with a lottery, and so in the end, I was never actually drafted or attempted to be drafted. But in the process, I also began to realize that something was missing in my dissatisfaction with the establishment, that there was some personal or individual dimension that I really needed to work on myself, as well as the kind of political system that we had at the time. So after that, I dropped out, and I ended up in Hawaii, which was originally going to be the first stop of a round the world trip. But I actually ended up living there for about 5 years, and that's where I became involved in Zen. Which of course was quite popular at the time. Fortunately, there was a Zen group there run by Robert Aiken, who later became a very well-known teacher, and his teacher, Yamada Koen, used to visit regularly from Japan, so that was also the beginning of my practice.
I wanted to ask David, we have many people on the show. Some are academics, some are practitioners. In your case, you're both. You've studied Zen very deeply. You've written extensively about it, and I guess a person could do that without being a practitioner. But you are a practitioner and a Zen teacher. Talk to us a little bit about the distinction between the two. And I guess the question I'm curious about is, does your Zen practice benefit from your academic work and writings about Zen, or are they two separate things?
For sure, they're very much connected. In fact, to some degree, I would say it's the opposite as well. That I ended up going back to university and getting a master's degree in Asian philosophy only after I'd lived in a couple Zen centers and practiced quite intensively. And this sort of piqued my interest in academia again, in that I wanted to find out more about the Asian non-dualist traditions, not only Zen and Buddhism, but Vedanta and Taoism, for example, just because of the kind of experiences that I was having. I was wanting to know more about how the different traditions understood and explained them. So for me, I felt very fortunate that the two have definitely gone together, that my Zen practice has helped me understand the sorts of things that I've talking about. But also it's true, as you say, that I think the academic perspective has sort of given me a somewhat different approach to the Zen practice as well.
If I could ask a follow-up question real quickly. You mentioned that you wanted to study more based upon experiences you were having in your practice. What were some of those experiences?
Well, those are obviously not so easy to describe, are they? There's always a certain ineffability to them. But one way that I have tried to talk about them is in terms of non-duality. That it felt like there were times when the sense of separation between a me inside and an objective world outside, that disappeared or evaporated. And it seemed to me that there was something quite revelatory and important going on when that happened. So I was very interested, especially in the early days, in sort of looking at this concept of subject-object non-duality and looking at how the different traditions, as I said, not only Buddhism, but Advaita Vedanta and Taoism, what they had to say about that.
You know, David, I was perusing your CV, and there's a long list of articles and essays, and I highlighted some of the titles that leaped out at me, partly because I'm a sucker for clever titles, but also some of the subject matter. And one of them is relevant to what you just said. It's quite an old piece of yours, but it's titled "How Many Non-Dualities Are There?" So my question is, how can there be more than one? Is one obvious question, but the other is, what was the point of that, and did you ever get an accurate count?
Well, you know, the word non-duality, it simply means not two, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, in general, you can say
so
that
it could be three.
No, yeah, not two, but less than
no.
three. Yeah.
Well, then it would be non-triality or non-trinity or something like that. Right.
Yeah.
But, you know, so normally the concept is just a denial that two things we normally think of as separate from each other are really separate. It turns out that they're two sides of the same coin. So this can mean a number of different things, or I should say it does mean a number of different things. One important example is non-duality of what we might call bipolar concepts, things like big, small, success, failure, good and evil. You know, we normally think of those as two separate concepts, but when you really start to think about them, you realize that if you don't understand what the word big means, you don't really know what small means. They're really two sides of the same thing. Mm-hmm. And this is important not only logically, but psychologically, because sometimes we get in a situation where we want one half of the duality and we want to avoid the other half. And it doesn't work like that. For example, if the most important thing for you is to live a pure life, whatever that means, it means that you're also going to have to be preoccupied with impurity, with avoiding impurity. It involves distinguishing every situation that we're in and asking, is this a pure act? Is this an impure act? And that becomes a kind of trap for the mind, which is why I think Kui Hai, one of the great Chan or Zen masters, said that true purity is to live beyond the duality of purity and impurity. So that's one small example. There's lots of other examples. In Buddhism, for example, in early Buddhism, there's a very strong distinction between samsara, this world of suffering, craving, delusion, and nibbana or nirvana. But then somebody like Nagarjuna, the Mahayana philosopher, comes along and says, well, no, those aren't really two separate realities or dimensions. They're simply, the sphere or the place, what he calls koti. They're not two separate places. It's pretty clear that they're two different ways of experiencing this reality right here and now. So those are two small examples, but the ones that are most fascinating to me is again, subject-object non-duality, where the sense of self becomes one with the object. And this applies, well, for example, sometimes this happens, I think, with music. I think many of us have a little taste of this when maybe we forget ourselves and we become one with the music, or in terms of our bodies or our physical activities. I think the Taoist paradox of Wei Wu Wei, the action of non-action, I think this is something that athletes sometimes experience when they really get in the groove or in the zone. And likewise, I think non-dual thinking is something that many of us have some taste of, because I think that's really what's referred to by creativity, true creativity, as so many really creative people say. It's not that they somehow create the thoughts, but the thoughts sort of spring up non-dually. So all of these are examples that could be elaborated in great detail about what non-duality means in different traditions.
David, in regard to non-duality, and this is an issue we've discussed with others, and one I really struggle with, is there an ultimate, do you believe, goal where the non-duality is permanent? The experience you had, say, someone might have with music, or whatever else that is experienced with the senses, that you become one with that. There's a lack of separation. Is the ultimate goal then in Buddhism, in whatever tradition that deals with non-duality, to come to a final goal where one sort of lives that non-duality 24/7?
Or is the goal rather realizing the non-duality of duality and non-duality?
Yeah, that's what I lie in bed at night thinking about, actually.
Well, I mean, it sounds funny, but I think that's right, in the sense that early on the path, you could say that we go on the path because we suffer, and we suffer usually because we're stuck identifying with some forms, you might say, something in the world. And so it's important, I think, to let go of this and to have some taste of non-duality. But it's not as though I think that's the ultimate goal, simply to reside in that what Buddhism might call emptiness or shunyata. Rather, it's I think practicing and living in such a way that those two dimensions become more and more interfused with each other, so that one isn't simply rejecting one dimension for the other, but somehow being comfortable, sort of spontaneously, flexibly, according to situations, sort of turning from one to the other, and ultimately realizing more and more as we live that they're not really two separate ways of experiencing it all, but that they really become unified. Or I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense.
David, Dennis asked you earlier about the interplay between your life as a practitioner and teacher and your academic career. I'd like to follow up on that a little bit. We've had, and I know personally, many academics who are also practitioners. And I know that, especially in the fields of Hindu and Buddhist studies, there's often, on the part of scholars, a suspicion of people who are also practitioners and especially teachers, that they would not have the requisite academic objectivity. And I know that the practitioners among them say, but without the living the life or having certain set of experiences, you can't possibly understand just by analyzing texts and so forth. Have you run into that? And have you run into it on the other side as well, where people say, excuse me, but we're Buddhists and we know that the finger pointing to the moon is not the moon, and you're busy pointing your finger and all this academic stuff. What is your take on all that?
It's very interesting that you highlight that, because that's something that I've experienced on both sides. I mean, it's not as though I myself have ever sort of minimized or denied the fact that I'm a Buddhist practitioner, but it is interesting that there are a great number of academics who do deny that. They really feel not simply that it's something that might compromise their objectivity in the eyes of others, but I also suspect that they think it may affect their chances for promotions and academic success in other ways, for sure. Yeah. And on the other side, what you see, of course, is a fair amount of what, frankly, I would call a kind of anti-intellectualism. Certainly in Zen, to be honest. I mean, it's clear that Zen practice is is non-intellectual for the most part. It tends not to have the study dimension that something like Gelugpa Tibetan Buddhism would have. But it's definitely true that there's this time, or that there's somewhat of a tendency for that non-intellectualism to shade off into a kind of anti-intellectualism, which I think is very unfortunate, because ultimately the path we're on is not about getting rid of thinking or getting rid of concepts, but rather learning to think, I think, in a deeper, more creative, more non-dual way. In other words, we shouldn't blame the victims in the sense of, well, I'm thinking of something Dogen said. Eihei Dogen, the great Japanese Zen master, in one of his fascicles in the Shobogenzo, he says something like, the goal isn't to get rid of concepts, but to liberate concepts. So that, again, we can think more deeply rather than being, trapped by them. So the problem isn't concepts themselves, but the way that we normally get enmeshed in them.
David, you've taught, been a professor in Singapore, in Japan, in South Africa, in Israel, in the Netherlands. You've been in many parts of the world. Does Buddhism take on different flavors in these different countries, and especially how does American Buddhism? Is it unique in any way? Is it different, and has it changed much from the 70s until now?
Well, I mean, the first thing to realize is that, Buddhism has built within it a tendency to transform. The Buddha emphasized impermanence and insubstantiality, and that applies to Buddhism itself. So every time Buddhism has gone to a new culture, it really hasn't just imposed itself, but it's tended to interact with the local culture and be transformed thereby. For example, the practice that I do, Zen or Chan Buddhism, the Buddha didn't teach that, but it's the kind of Buddhism that developed in China originally when Mahayana Buddhism interacted with the Chinese Taoism. So the really fascinating issue now is, how is Buddhism changing as it comes to the modern world, which is certainly the greatest challenge that it's ever faced, in the sense that the modern world is not simply so technological and so secular, but also, to be quite honest, it's a world in crisis, and one of the really important issues, therefore, is what does Buddhism have to offer that can help us understand and respond to these crises. Buddhism is changing in a number of ways. First of all, psychologically, I think that's probably been the main way so far. Over the last generation, we now have a large number of therapists, trained therapists, who are also Buddhist practitioners, and in some cases also teachers, authorized teachers within their own traditions. So there's been a kind of psychologization of Buddhism. In addition to that, a number of people have noted what's sometimes called a feminization of Buddhism, in the sense that it's certainly more than half the people engaged in serious Buddhist practice are women. When I offer workshops and retreats, it's rare that it's less than 2/3, which is quite interesting if you think about it. Yeah. And then finally, the biggest thing, of course, is Buddhism, which in its own Asian environment never emphasized social justice. Now it comes into a context where that's a really important issue. Issues of, obvious ones, racism, growing gap between rich and poor, and of course the increasingly grave ecological crisis that we now face.
David, it's very interesting because more of my time is spent in the sort of Hindu equivalent and the yoga world, and the same trends you will observe there. I wrote about the feminization of these teachings and so forth. So I think there's a parallel, probably because there's a similar demographic. Some people find their way to yogic things and others to Buddhism. But I think we want to pursue a little bit more how Buddhism can inform these grave social issues. But I'm also, before that, I want to ask you something. It's another article title of yours, and it's the reverse. It's why Buddhism needs the West. And I'm very curious about what you meant by that and what your conclusions are.
If it's the article I'm thinking of, it's probably why Buddhism and the West need each other.
No, it just says why Buddhism needs the West. It was in Tricycle.
Interesting. Yeah. In Tricycle. Okay. Basically, the argument that I usually make is, and I'm afraid I don't recall that specific one, is that as I said, the emphasis in the Western tradition, Western civilization, which traces itself largely back to the Greeks and to the Hebrews. The emphasis there has been social justice, especially in the modern world. The idea that we can restructure our societies so they are more socially just. And clearly, we have a long way to go, but also an awful lot's been accomplished in the last couple hundred years, if you think about it. And yet there's still this oddity that in some ways we seem to be moving backwards. If you look, for example, at the growing gap between rich and poor, so we may wonder what's going on there. And then on the other side, Buddhism, for I think a number of historical reasons, the focus in Buddhism hasn't been on social transformation or what we might call social dukkha, social justice, social suffering. It's very much been on the individual level, the idea that through our own meditative practice, we can come to realize something about our own true nature that will, liberate us from certain types of suffering. And so the basic point, I think, is that we're at a time now where not only do those two traditions sort of come together, we know so much more about each of them, but it's also a situation where we need both. I think that social transformation without individual transformation, I think we can see the problems that arise from that. If you think about how's the best way to express this? If people haven't worked on themselves, there's always going to be this tendency to sort of take advantage of one's situation. Buddhism talks a lot about the three poisons of greed, ill will, delusion. If you're, for example, a revolutionary leader who overthrows a really nasty dictator, and now you have sort of ultimate supreme power, if you haven't worked on your own greed, it's going to be very difficult not to take advantage of that situation. If you haven't worked on your own ill will, it's going to be hard not to see people who have different ideas as enemies and to be eliminated or controlled. And if you don't really have some sense of your own ego and how that gets in the way, the tendency is going to be to sort of understand the solution to all problems as just imposing your ideas on everybody else. And I think we see that now. I think that helps us understand why so often revolutions have, even when they've been well-intended, they end up just replacing one gang of thugs with another. Right. So we can see it on that side, and it works on the other side as well. I think that, interestingly, if you go back and really sort of read the Pali Canon, the earliest texts, very carefully, I think the Buddha was a lot more progressive than the institution that developed after he died. I think it clearly shows a great sensitivity to the situation of women, which in its historical context was huge, and also his attitude toward caste. He was very critical, and he conceived of the Sangha that he created as a casteless organization where people lost their caste when they joined. So, as I said, I think he was very progressive, but historically, the way the institution evolved was that in order to survive and thrive, it had to come to some kind of accommodation with the state. And the Karma teaching in particular, I think, lends itself to that. it encourages a kind of social acceptance. If somebody's born a king or a prince and will become a king, then he obviously deserves that. If you're born poor, disabled in some way, well, don't blame anybody else except yourself. So the karma teaching, I think, could contribute to this sort of rather narrow preoccupation with one's own individual karma, individual suffering, individual delusion, and so forth. But the positive side of that is that Buddhism has created what's very likely the world's greatest collection of contemplative practices that can help us transform ourselves. It's just that it hasn't, up to this point, had much to say about social transformation.
David, in 2014, you received an honorary doctorate from Carleton College, your alma mater. Shortly thereafter, you returned in 2016 that honorary degree to the college to protest the decision of the board not to divest from fossil fuel companies. Tell us about that. And I know you're deeply committed to environmental issues. Is that something that was inspired as a Buddhist, or how did you come to that, and how can Buddhism help deal with our environmental crisis?
Well, yeah, what happened originally is I was awarded the honorary degree in appreciation of my contribution to sort of Buddhist studies, and especially sort of the relevance or the social implications of Buddhist teachings. But I couldn't help notice that the Carleton College, as much as I appreciate it and my training there, that there was still a problem with the Board of Trustees, that they have in fact been quite resistant to divesting. I mean, it's not the case that Carleton has a lot of money directly invested in fossil fuels, but I also think it's a really important symbolic gesture to sort of shift from something like fossil fuels to more renewable sources of energy. So that was one way to protest it as part of a larger movement that's going on there of students, alumni, and some faculty and staff as well, which is one of the main thrusts of 350.org, by the way, helping or encouraging institutions such as colleges and churches to divest from fossil fuels. Yeah. What was the other part of your question?
How do you see Zen Buddhism? Two things. Was the practice of Zen Buddhism that you're involved in instrumental in you becoming as strong an environmentalist as you are? And are there tools, are there procedures, are there teachings within Zen that would help those and it should be everybody, but those that are concerned about the future of the environment?
Normally, I don't talk so much about Zen in the environment, but I sort of generalize about Buddhism in general. I mean, the philosophy of Zen is largely Mahayana Buddhism. So in general, I wouldn't want to focus too narrowly on Zen, because I think there's also so much more available in the larger tradition. But maybe I can answer your question indirectly by looking at this new developing field of eco-dharma. The word dharma, as you know, is important in Hinduism as well as Buddhism. But as understood in Buddhism, it's really looking at the sort of link between traditional Asian Buddhism, or Buddhism as it's developed up to this point, and the kind of ecological crisis that we're facing right now. It's a new term, and I think we're still sort of giving it content. But for me, three things stand out. One of them is, first of all, meditation in the natural world. And this is something that's been very important to me for a while. In the last few years, I've been co-leading wilderness retreats with another teacher here in the Boulder area, Johan Robbins. And it's quite interesting if you think about it, like just in terms of the traditional life of the Buddha, the kind of story that we're all familiar with. He really had this thing for nature, especially trees. He was not only born in the Lumbini Grove when his mother went into early labor, but when you think of him leaving home, where did he go? He went out into the forest. That's where he studied. That's where he meditated. He became enlightened under a tree, and thereafter he largely lived, taught, and then died out in the natural world. And it's interesting that this applies not only to the Buddha, but if you think about somebody like Jesus, after he was baptized by John the Baptist, he went out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And Muhammad had his cave. What's going on here? Is there something about the natural world that can really open us up or help us let go? And I think there is. I think that when we only meditate in urban or buildings, there's obviously some advantages in terms of temperature control, screens to keep out insects and so forth. But I also think something is lost,
Right.
in the sense that when we're out in the natural world, we're opening up to living organic things. Out in the natural world, we're not in an urban environment where basically everything is a collection of utensils for us to use one way or the other. And it can open up other possibilities there, which is not to say it's necessary, but I think it can definitely contribute something and make us appreciate that world more. Sorry, go ahead.
So we should all have an air-conditioned, screened cabin in the woods.
Well,
combine the best of both.
Exactly.
But I have a question, David.
Sure.
With your passionate activism and your equal passion for the inner life as expressed particularly through Buddhism, do you ever run into resistance in the Buddhist community to the social activism? Is there any sense that this is not what a teacher of Buddhism should be doing?
For sure. But let me just say two more quick things about Eco-Dharma, if I may.
Yeah.
Because the other thing that I would add, first of all, is Eco-Dharma is about looking at Buddhist, and I think we can add Hindu teachings of, what do they have to say about the natural world, and what do they therefore imply about how we respond to the ecological crisis. And then thirdly, I think it's also for Buddhism, we have this concept of the bodhisattva, someone who wants to become awakened not just for themselves, but to help everyone else as well. And I think a very important part of Eco-Dharma is what some people are now calling the eco-sattva. In other words, understanding the path is not simply sort of meditating for your own awakening, for your own peace of mind, but also realizing that it's important to use that as a kind of a basis to go out and then engage in a kind of non-attached spirit. So these for me are the three aspects of Eco-Dharma, and one could say a lot more about them. But you're certainly right that there is or there has been a fair amount of resistance to this within the Buddhist world. In fact, I would say until 3 or 4 years ago, I was quite surprised by not so much the resistance, but the indifference. I was offering a number of workshops, for example, on Buddhism and social issues and ecological issues, and especially ecologically, people just weren't signing up. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think the main one has to do with the fact that there are aspects of Buddhism, as we find in many other spiritual traditions, that tend to dualize between this world and some other higher world, and so the encouragement is not to sort of engage with this world, but to escape or transcend it, and people therefore think that ecological or social engagement is really not the point.
David, thank you so much for your time today. Phil, do you have any final questions or points?
Yes, I have one question, and I know it's a loaded one, but maybe David
we saved those for last.
Maybe he could answer it concisely. we alluded to Buddhism adapting to different environments and now to this crazy Western modern world. Are you ever concerned that the forms of adaptation can dilute or distort in any way the teachings? And I have in mind some, the incredible sudden secularization and popularity of mindfulness practice. What's your take on it?
Good question.
And it's interesting. Of course, there's something comparable to that in the yogic tradition,
Absolutely.
isn't there? Yeah,
Yes.
For sure. Yes, I mean, it's a complicated issue. There was a time when I started Zen practice when I was so excited. I thought this was the solution, and everyone's going to want to do this. And when you realize at a certain point that everyone isn't going to want to do this, it raises this larger issue of, okay, how can traditions like Buddhism impact the modern world, which is so different? And so to a large extent, I'm quite sympathetic to the mindfulness movement, especially when it comes to health issues and educational. Yeah, I think it becomes rather more problematical when you look at its role in the business world, because it can basically be used to sort of help employees adapt to a difficult situation rather than encouraging the kind of larger economic transformations that I think are called for. In other words, sometimes employees are overburdened with very stressful jobs. They just have too much work to do, and rather than reduce their workload, you can see that sometimes corporations will encourage the mindfulness courses, to help them cope better. Well, I'm not sure that's the best solution to the problem, and I'm not sure that that's what mindfulness is for. At the same time, mindfulness can be a kind of a wedge or a kind of a Trojan horse, in the sense that, when people start doing mindfulness, they don't necessarily understand or know how that's going to change them. So I think for many people, it would offer a kind of opening that they otherwise wouldn't be available to. Does this lose something? Well, for sure, in the sense that I think the Buddhist path has so much more to offer. But given the practicalities of the kind of world that we're in, I mean, I see that as an important or potentially very important sort of opening that will hopefully, in the long run, tend to bring in these larger concerns. For example, within the mindfulness movement, there's already a sub-movement of people who are very concerned about social issues and are concerned about how to try to integrate those. So I see that as a positive thing.
Great.
Yeah.
David, I thought of one last question I have to ask, and that is, can one be an agnostic and a Buddhist at the same time?
Well,
this is not a joke or a punchline. It's a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to be, in the sense that, well, for example, just thinking about Zen practice, right? I mean, in Zen, we talk a lot about Kensho or enlightenment or, first opening up. But that kind of awakening, it's not as though now you understand everything. I mean, awakening opens us up to a mysterious world where we don't really know. One of my teachers, Robert Aiken, put it very well when he said, our path isn't about clearing up the mystery, but making the mystery clear. So in the literal sense of agnostic, not knowing, I think that's a very important part of the path. We do what we need to do as well as we understand our situation. But nonetheless, the path is about opening up to a kind of fundamental mystery where we really don't know.
Great answer. Thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today. Wonderful.
My pleasure. I hope some of that will be of some interest to some of the people who listen in. But thank you very much for this invitation.
It was our pleasure, and we hope to have you back sometime. And
Absolutely.
we'll look forward to seeing how things work out with Ecodharma. And
thank you. One thing I forgot to mention is, and maybe this would be the topic for next time, is I'm one of the founders of a new Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center up in the mountains near Boulder, and that's something that might be worth talking about in a future interview.
And we'll make
Very
sure that
good.
information about that is posted on our
Thank you.
podcast site. Yeah, great.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, David. Keep up the good work.
You guys too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.